I suppose for the purposes of today's discussion, it's worth bearing in mind that Michael's traveled the world reporting and studying. He was in Chernobyl to report on the disaster there. He was in Ukraine in 2014 when Crimea kicked off, and he's got Ukrainian heritage as well. Michael, let's get stuck straight into it. Let's begin with Ukraine. Looking forward to what's going to happen next in the future there. I've been quite struck by the narrative coming out in the past couple of weeks where 2 weeks ago, it seems that the Ukrainian counteroffensive was completely on the move. It was a mini victory for Ukraine. Contrast that with yesterday where Putin stood up in Moscow and declared that he's going to annex these 4 regions. Where do you think it's going to go next?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for being here. Well, look, I think right now what we're seeing is a split-screen reality. I think you have a Mr. Putin who is increasingly out of touch with reality, who is desperate, essentially because of humiliating, devastating battlefield losses to the point where he had to widen the conscription of men heading towards Ukraine to 300,000. And that was a very significant move in the sense that now basically every area code of Russia is now going to be impacted in one way or the other. And all of us saw the reaction of many of the Russians who are of conscription age. They fled or went into hiding. But and talking about that speech, which was, out of the Putin playbook, blaming the West for all of the ills, blaming the West for trying to destroy Russia. I think on the one hand, he's trying to whip up domestic support, get Russians rallied around him, but on the other hand, I think, talking about him being out of touch, I don't think he's recognizing what's actually happening on the battlefield, including today, by the way, which there have been even more significant Ukrainian gains. The Russian Defense Ministry admitted a retreat of Russian forces from basically the same regions where Mr. Putin has announced the illegal absorption. So, but this was, the speech was, to me, a major crossing of a red line. I actually would have expected more in terms of a Western reaction, especially from the White House. Instead, Mr. Biden and admittedly, America has done a lot to support Ukraine in terms of funding, in terms of weaponry, in terms of ammunition, in terms of training, in terms of satellite intelligence, that sort of thing. But just widening the sanctions, saying that we're going to target people at the central bank or people in Putin's circle, I don't think that is much of a deterrent for Mr. Putin. I think I may be jumping ahead of myself, but I think there is a question about what we should learn from recent history. I think Mr. Putin still lives in 2014, where he illegally annexed Crimea and his Russian-backed thugs invaded the Donbass, and I was there when that was happening. And not much of a finger was lifted by the West. So I think he still feels that he can get away with these things. And, I end this with one major point, is that the only thing thugs or dictators respond to is strength, and we're not seeing enough at the moment.
So, in terms of, I suppose, the Western response then, how far should the West go? Obviously, at the moment, we're seeing huge energy price increases over here in Britain and across the West in general, as a response to the conflict going on. How far should governments be pushing it when they're responding, do you think? And how far do you think they will go, which I suppose is the next question?
Well, I guess the luxuries that Vladimir Putin and people like Xi Jinping have is they don't have to face an electorate every year or every few years. You become leader for life. And I think, as I write in the book, dictators learn from each other and they follow each other. But I think if I can answer it this way, what we probably should have done to help prevent this. And one thing is, I don't think the West anticipated what Mr. Putin would do earlier this year in February. And there were a lot of flashing red lights well ahead of time of the full-scale invasion. One of them was that rambling 5,000-word article from July 12th of last year called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, where Mr. Putin basically argued that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, that these are traditionally Russian lands. Well, that's not true. But I think this was a call to battle, a call to war. And then I think the other big flashing red light that the West didn't react to earlier enough was that, remember that months-long buildup of Russian forces and Russian armaments along the borders of Ukraine, including in Belarus. The other...
what do you think that we should have done then?
I think, well, for example, what should have been done is the training, the supply of weaponry, the supply of ammunition should have happened a lot earlier. Mm-hmm. I think it's I'm not only going to point the finger at the White House or the Elysee Palace in Paris, I'm also going to, and I've said this publicly, the United Nations system, humanitarian aid agencies was woefully unprepared. Up until the lead up of the invasion, I mean, I was receiving calls from New York UN headquarters asking me if I thought the war was going to happen. I said, for sure, what happened? And yet they did not preposition people and they did not preposition supplies. And this is a really important point because, for example, the World Food Program, which is basically the FedEx of the aid system, was scrambling after the invasion started to get crucial life-saving supplies inside Ukraine. WHO, the same thing. And the other thing that really angered people like me, including former colleagues of mine who still work in the UN system, is that it took weeks before the Secretary General of the Director General of WHO or the Executive Director of UNICEF could use the R word and say it was Russia that invaded. They couldn't even utter the word Russia in their official statements, fearing that it might, spark some kind of reaction from Russia. So there are a lot of mistakes, I think, on a number of areas. And then again, the sanctions issue, they should have been implemented beforehand, as the Ukrainians were begging, to act more as a deterrent. Because as we're now finding, sanctions take a long time to take hold, to make an impact. As I said last night on another panel, I'm not an advocate of sanctions being used to hurt the common man, because eventually these trickle down and often hurt the most vulnerable. But they have been used, I think, in the past as a deterrent, and I think they were just implemented too late.
So looking forward then, we've looked at what the mistakes are made, 18 months or so ago. Looking forward to, ending this conflict, I mean, do you see that on the horizon? And if not, how do you think we get there?
Sadly, I think this is going to take us well into next year. I think it's going to be a very difficult winter, not only for you all with higher energy bills, things like that, but also for the Ukrainian people. We're hoping that the long-range forecasts are correct, that it's going to be a mild winter, but with the Russians going about and deliberately destroying civilian infrastructure, for example, in many parts of Ukraine, the heating systems the distribution systems are actually above ground, so they're very vulnerable to attack. So we have to do everything possible. On one hand, the humanitarian side, make sure that Ukrainians can get as much equipment available as possible to heat their homes, warm clothing, things like that. But on the standing up to Russia side, I think we have to continue with the training, the provision of high-tech weapons and ammunition. Ukrainians tell me they need a lot more tanks. They need a lot more helicopters. The one thing that I have been evangelizing about from day one is to give the Ukrainians the ability to protect their own skies. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about a no-fly zone. That is something the West is not prepared to do. But for as long as the Russians have this huge stockpile of long-range weapons, the sort that can fly at very high altitude, at very high speed, and very long distances, all the way to the Ukrainian-Polish border, places like Lviv, Odessa, where I'm now based, no inch of Ukraine can be considered safe. I think that behind the scenes, the U.S. administration is provisioning the Ukrainians with quite high-tech technology that they're able to fire at these missiles and bring them down before they strike. I understand, for example, Kiev will be protected more or less with the same technology that protects Washington, D.C. That's pretty hot stuff. But at the moment, for example, if 6 Russian missiles are headed towards Odessa, the Ukrainians have the ability on average to bring down about 4 of them. But what they really want is something like the Iron Dome system.
I suppose, the one weapon which you haven't mentioned is nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And you talk about, in your book, you talk about Chernobyl moments, and you talk about COVID being one of those, which fundamentally changes the way that society operates and how we view defense. What do you think the likelihood of Putin resorting to that nuclear weapon might be? And also, I suppose, presumably looking forward, if that's something that we don't want, we have to be aware of that in our Western response as well.
Yeah. I think we should hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. You mentioned Chernobyl. I think it was what we're seeing is history repeating itself, whether it's the using of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant as a weapon, or the stealing of grain, or the forced deportation of Ukrainians to remote parts of Russia. This has all happened in Ukraine's past modern history. We saw in 1986 with the Chernobyl nuclear disaster that a lot of this was done out of sheer stupidity and carelessness. It boggles the mind, it really boggles the mind to think that the Russians returned to Chernobyl in February, March, occupied it, and started doing things like digging up contaminated soil and spreading it, taking over the control rooms and telling the Ukrainian staff there what to do. And then what do? They do the same thing with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which, by the way, is the largest in Europe. And just in the past 24 hours, we've heard of the head of that plant being detained. But for weeks now, the staff there have been working under very, very difficult conditions. The Russians have parked their vehicles, ammunition there. We have been headed very, very close to a disaster there. In terms of your question about the nuclear weapons, I don't think we can exclude that from Mr. Putin's ranges of options. He has threatened to use them. I actually don't think he's bluffing. But I think a bigger likelihood would be for him to use chemical and biological weapons against civilian populations. Why do I think that? Is because just look at what they've done to cities like Mariupol or to Kharkiv, or just in the past 48 hours, the deliberate targeting of a civilian convoy. I think it's now 28 killed in that one. As soon as we thought we've seen the basement of Russian inhumanity to man, they tend to surprise us and do even worse. So one more point on this. I think what they would do is make it look like an accident, maybe a chemical or biological leak, plausible deniability, and then say it wasn't our fault, but it causes huge harm.
Because presumably if that happens, I mean, Putin will know that there will be an enhanced Western response. Let's say there's a chemical accident that the West isn't going to buy, just in the same way that I suppose the West hasn't bought these sham referendums in the East. He knows that the West would step up their support of Ukraine, which is something that he can't afford. So, I mean, do you really think that he would risk that?
I think, zooming out and generally speaking, when the West does not make clear what its red lines are, as it was in Syria with the chemical weapons.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.